remember what their real goal was and what they had to do. I'm 83 years old.
Good evening, everyone. What a wonderful crowd. I'm so excited to see you all here. My name is Dr. Bertrand. I'm the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society, and I'm so thrilled to see such a lovely crowd this evening, and so many of our partners here. Hi, thank you for being here. I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank you all for coming out on this beautiful, glorious evening. A wonderful early spring night in Newport. And take the opportunity to point out a few things that were on your chair this evening. One is a list of our upcoming spring lectures. Other than this evening's talk, we have another talk in March, on March 21st, and then 2 in April, just to point out for you. So there's a QR code on the front there that you can scan to get tickets for some upcoming lectures. And then also I wanted to point out a database project that we just launched that might be of interest to you. That's Voices from the NHS Archives, which was a 4-year-long collaborative research project that was a really wonderful archival database project to go through our manuscript collection and cull the archive to look for references to Black and Indigenous people through years and years of work through our staff and our summer research fellows, and take this opportunity to take those collections and make them available for researchers around the world online. And so now if you scan this QR code, and I'm not sure if these were on your chairs, they might not have been, so those are out in the lobby, and I apologize for that. But if you scan this QR code, it takes you right to our online resource, and you can find it also by going to newporthistory.org. It's available entirely free, and it's an opportunity for you to go on and search that website and look for references to Black and Indigenous people on our website, to find not only references to the names of people who were living in Newport in the 17th through 19th centuries, but also their life events. So when they were freed, or when they were married, where they were living, and these are opportunities also to see digitized records online. So I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for genealogists. It's also for scholars, and a really wonderful resource for people around the world. So it's just one way that we're now online in a different kind of way. And that's going to be turned into an exhibition that's opening here in our resource center on May 29th. And will be up all summer long. It's called A Name, a Life, a Voice, the Black Newporters from the 17th to 19th century. So that'll be in this room and then also in the lobby. So thank you all for being here, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Sulak, our Public Programs Director, who will tell you about this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Becca. Tonight we are pleased to host author Shirley Green to discuss her new book, Revolutionary Blacks, Discovering the Frank Brothers, Freedom, Men of Color, Soldiers of Independence. But before we dive into tonight's event, I'd like to thank our partners for co-hosting this program with us, the Battle of Rhode Island Association. Without their support, this event would not be possible. I also invite you to join us for our March 21st lecture, Hope Deferred, George T. Downing and the 19th Century Civil Rights Movement. This talk will explore the life and career of one of the most important civil rights activists of the 19th century. Tonight's program follows the lives of William and Benjamin Frank, brothers who enlisted in the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment during the American Revolution in the spring of 1777. Their military experiences quickly diverged. Dr. Green will explore their stories to provide context and substance to the Black experience during the war, as well as underscore the distinction between free Blacks in military service and those who have been enslaved, including how they responded in different ways to the harsh realities of racism. Dr. Green completed her PhD at Bowling Green State University, where her research, which examines the African American past through family history, has won numerous awards. She currently teaches U.S. history at the University of Toledo and Bowling Green State University, and she serves as the director of the Toledo Police Museum. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shirley Green.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Really happy to be here this evening. If you cannot hear me at any point in time, which should not really be a problem for me, please let me know. So first off, I want to thank the Battle Rhode Island Association, especially Joe Studlick, for coordinating this visit, and also Jim Stearns for getting me here tonight. So thank you all. I want to thank the Newport Historical Society for hosting and sponsoring this event this evening. I also want to thank a personal thank you to Christian McBurney, who is here tonight, for providing more insight for me in regards to the Battle at Rhode Island, and also his greatly appreciated review of my book. So this is not my first time visiting Newport. I've been here on several occasions. My late cousin, Dr. Donna Gilton, lived in Peacedale, Rhode Island. She taught at the University of Rhode Island, and she was a member of the Mount Zion AME Church, which is located here in Newport. So it's a pleasure to be back, and I want to thank you all for coming this evening, and I want to tell you a story about my family here. So we're going to start with understanding about what my book is. My book is part family history, and it's part microhistory. Microhistory is when you focus on a person, an event, a community, a location, and you on a very small level, and you try to tell a bigger story from that, okay? I was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio. So was my father. My mother, however, was born and raised in Lynn, Massachusetts. Her father was born and raised in Nova Scotia, Canada. And this is where the family history part of my story takes place. Most family historians and microhistorians start out their research trying to answer questions or mysteries about a certain ancestor or a certain aspect of a history. When I first started my research, I was trying to answer the question of how my maternal grandfather came to be born and raised in Canada. As I started to address that question, another question arose. How did the experiences of my ancestors inform us about the experiences and actions of free blacks in revolutionary America? This book is the culmination of my journey to answer those questions. So I want to start with my maternal great-grandfather. That is Thomas Henry Franklin. He was a landscaper at one of the oldest cemeteries in North America in Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. This picture was taken by a local historian named William Ingalls, who was conducting research for a book on the oldest gravestones in North America. The book is titled The Gravestones of Acadie. They had a conversation on this day that he took the picture in the late 1920s, and part of the conversation is on the screen there. He asked my grandfather, "What is your name?" My grandfather responds, "My name is Henry Franklin, an uncommon name in these parts. My grandfather came from Africa." And then he said, "How old are you?" And he said, "I just turned 70, which is funny for me to be standing up in front of you saying that quote about my grandfather, because I could say the same about myself, because I just turned 70. So it's cyclical here with the family history. Henry Franklin passed away shortly before the publication of the book in 1929. He just recited a very small part of the Franklin oral history to William Ingalls. The entire Franklin oral tradition was that the first Franklin ancestor came to America from the west coast of Africa by way of Haiti. And two of his descendants, two brothers with the last name of Frank, fought in the Black Regiment of Rhode Island in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. So I believe that the first Frank came to America by the late 1600s, and this is backed up by DNA testing. This person was caught up in the tragedy that was the transatlantic human trade. He came to North America from the west coast of Africa, a member of the Away people who reside now in present-day Togo. This young man arrived in the Caribbean and was set to labor in the plantations of the French colony Saint-Domingue, which is present-day Haiti. Either this young man or one of his male offspring came as a victim of the intercolonial slave trade between the Caribbean and mainland North America. He was sold into slavery in Rhode Island and set to work in the town of Providence, Rhode Island. I believe that the first Frank ancestor in America was captured in 5 documents living and working in colonial Rhode Island. By the late 1690s, this man was free and an active member of Providence, Rhode Island, and he was known by the name of Frank. He owned a parcel of land, and he worked as a servant of a large land-owning family by the name of the Carpenters. On the screen are portions of 4 of those documents. The first 3 documents detail the actual land transaction between Frank Negro and an individual by the name of Ephraim Carpenter. As you can see under Article 432, the arrow is pointing to reference to Frank, my ancestor, and it says Frank, Negro servant of Silas Carpenter. The next document, 47, a month later, he mortgaged that same property to get some additional cash. And you can see he's still denoted as Frank, Negro servant to Silas Carpenter. But the document that is listed as 65, several years later after he paid off the mortgage from Article 47, he is just listed as Frank Negro of Providence, Rhode Island. And I generally use these documents when I'm teaching about free blacks in colonial America, particularly in colonial Rhode Island, and I ask the students, when did he gain his freedom? How can you tell from these documents on the screen? And the smarter ones who sit up the front of the class will point to 65 and say somewhere in between these two documents. The other document on the screen is an affidavit. Frank was attacked by a fellow resident of Providence, Rhode Island, a guy with the last name of Sprague. And the criminal complaint summarizes the attack, which is on the screen there, which appeared to be provoked by Frank. Some actions that he said, maybe something he said to Sprague. But he went to the local authorities, Frank did, and Sprague was charged, convicted, and fined an amount of 2 shillings and 4 pence for his, quote, misbehavior, unquote, against Frank. So Frank obviously knew and understood the dynamics of how things worked in colonial Providence. I also believe that this industrious Frank fathered at least 2 sons by the name of Andrew and Rufus. Andrew and Rufus probably followed a West African custom of adopting their father's first name as their last name. Both Andrew and Rufus Frank lived and worked in Providence, Rhode Island in the 1700s. Both served in the militia and were called out to fight off threats to their community. Andrew died in 1756, but his brother Rufus lived on and served in the French and Indian War as a member of the militia out of Providence. Rufus, as a member of the Providence militia, was required to do so because most all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 to 60 were required to serve in the militia. However, this was not generally required for black men, who were normally exempted from military service and were instead required to perform other civic duties like road cleaning and road repair. But during times of major warfare, the exemptions against black service were disregarded, such as when Great Britain became involved in a war against France and France's Native American allies in the French and Indian War. Rufus served as a member of the Providence militia during the war from 1757 to 1761. He was stationed primarily in a region that is present-day Western New York State. He served in 3 separate campaigns. What you're looking at on the screen is a picture on the lower side here of Fort Stanwich, which is located near Rome, New York. In 1762, Spain jumped into the conflict on the side of France, and Rhode Island mustered its troops to assist with the capture of Cuba, which was a Spanish colony. Rufus and others made their way to New York. They sailed to Havana, and they laid siege and captured a fortress in Havana's harbor, which basically ended the siege. After they won that victory, Rufus and his fellow troops would return home. After the war, Rufus settled in Johnston, Rhode Island, a small town just north of Providence. He married. He had 3 children. He had 2 sons, William and Ben. He had 1 daughter, Hannah. The Frank household was one of 10 free black households in Johnston, Rhode Island. The family is numerated in the 1774 colonial Rhode Island census on the far right-hand side, which was an area that was designated for blacks and Native Americans. Rufus and his family were part of a growing black population before the Revolutionary War. There were approximately 500,000 people of African descent, which made up about 20% of the population. Most of them were enslaved. A very small percentage of blacks were free, and they lived under very restrictive conditions like the Franks. Free blacks composed 10% of the Rhode Island population at this point in time. As the war progressed, the desires of these 500,000 people could be separated into 2 categories as defined by historian Ira Berlin. The enslaved were looking for liberty and freedom, and free blacks were looking for equality. The enslaved were looking for liberty and freedom, and free blacks were looking for equality. And throughout the duration of the war, they would judge who could and would grant their desires, the British or the Americans. William and Ben would follow in their father's footsteps and serve in the military during the Revolutionary War. But before they could serve, there had to be a change in American military policy. All right? And that change was started by an individual by the name of John Murray. He was the Earl of Dunmore, and he was also the appointed royal governor of Virginia. By November of 1775, he was running his affairs, his business, on a ship in the Chesapeake Bay because he had been run out of his headquarters by Patriot forces. On November 7th, 1775, he issued a proclamation that promised freedom to enslaved men who fought for Great Britain. The offer was made to, and I do hereby further declare all indentured servants, Negroes or others appertaining to rebels, meaning only the patriots, folks, free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as they may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. Dunmore was just looking for a way to regain power and help Great Britain to win the war by draining very valuable resources from the Patriot cause, like enslaved labor. One of the many enslaved men and women who fled to Dunmore and the British lines was Henry Washington, also known as Harry Washington, who was enslaved to George Washington. Henry became a member of Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment. Dunmore trained over 800 formerly enslaved men in the basics of musket shooting and formation marching. He had special uniforms made for them with the insignia of liberty to the slaves embroidered on the front of their uniforms. The regiment fought in two major battles. The last battle they fought in was the battle at Great Bridge, Virginia, which they lost. They lost lives at both of those battles, and they also lost lives to the epidemic of smallpox. However, Dunmore's proclamation created one of the first mass emancipation of black slaves prior to the Civil War. An estimated 80 to 100,000 enslaved people fled to British lines during the war, women and children among them seeking their freedom. So, the Frank brothers were able to enlist after a change in American military policy. At the beginning of the war, George Washington banned the use of black soldiers in the Continental Army. The militia troops that fought at the initial battles at Lexington and Concord were diverse. They had white, black, and Native American soldiers serving together. But Washington believed that you could not have a professional army with black soldiers, and he could not attract Southern planters by arming blacks, free or enslaved. So in July of 1775, after he took control of the Continental forces, he instructed his recruiting officers in the following manner, and part of the quote is on the screen. Quote, "You are not to enlist any deserter from the ministerial army, nor any stroller, Negro, or vagabond, or person suspected of being an enemy to the liberty of America," unquote. That caused the expulsion of black soldiers who were already fighting with the Continental forces. Washington would continue this policy throughout the fall of 1775. However, Dunmore Proclamation happens, and George Washington started to revise his policy toward black soldiers. Washington was also pressured by command officers and black community leaders like Prince Hall, the leader of the Black Freemason movement, to allow the service of black veterans, soldiers who had already proven themselves in battle. So Washington changed his policy. In January of 1776, he allowed for the enlistment of free black veterans. The following year, he allowed for the enlistment of all free blacks. By war's end, anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000, and this is always being debated, black soldiers would serve in the Continental Army. William Frank, the older brother, signed up to serve with the Rhode Island State Brigade at Tiverton, Rhode Island in April 1777. Later that year, he was enlisted into the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. He was around 17 years old. His younger brother, Benjamin, signed up to serve with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment at Providence in May of the same year. He was 15 years old. His father probably had to give him his permission for his son to enlist. Why did they enlist? For a variety of reasons, mostly for economic concerns. They were members of the working class. They were listed as general laborers. Their father, that I can find any documentation on, did not own land. With enlistment, they could look forward to, or they thought they could look forward to, earning a steady wage and receiving food and equipment. And given the limited opportunities for free blacks and other members of the working class, military service was one of the few ways to better your life. Congress approved enlistment bonuses, and Congress had also approved promises of land at war's end. So this is a way for members of the working class to work their way out of their tough circumstances. Were soldiers of color treated differently than their white counterparts? They initially served in integrated regiments and companies. So as freeborn black men, the Frank brothers were receiving the sought-after equality that many free blacks were looking for. What were they actually getting themselves into? They became members of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, which was commanded by Colonel Israel Angel, who at one point in his life resided in the Frank brothers' hometown of Johnston, Rhode Island. The state of Rhode Island was tasked by Congress to provide 2 infantry regiments, the 1st Rhode Island and the 2nd Rhode Island, and the regiments were integrated. The Franks were not signing up for easy duty. Continental soldiers lived very tough life. Pay was very sporadic due to the limited treasury of the new federal government and also state governments as well. They were sometimes issued muskets and bayonets. They were issued clothing that consisted of hunting shirts, similar to smocks, as Jason Rome is wearing back there as a reenactor. They were large enough to cover their own other clothing and equipment. Shoes were always in short supply. In summer, soldiers could go barefoot, and in winter, they had to wrap their feet in cloth. Soldiers often resorted to foraging in the countryside for food. They also had to deal with diseases that ran rampant through their camps. There was a smallpox epidemic during the war. On the screen is how Colonel Angel described the situation of the men who served in the Rhode Island Regiment the first year of William and Ben Frank's service. He said, "The regiment is scandalous in its appearance in the view of everyone, and has because of this incurred from surrounding regiments, from the inhabitants of towns through which they have lately passed, the disagreeable and provoking epithets of the ragged, lousy," meaning their uniforms were filled with lice, "naked regiment. Such treatment, gentlemen, is discouraging, dispiriting in its tendencies. It does effectually unman the man, and render them almost useless in the army." This was the reality of service that the Frank brothers were getting themselves into. During their first year of service, the first major battle that they were engaged in occurred at Red Bank. The 2 Rhode Island regiments were dispatched to defend the forts along the Delaware River between Pennsylvania and New Jersey in October of 1777. Maryland and Connecticut troops were stationed at Fort Mifflin, which is the yellow arrow there, and the Rhode Island regiments were sent to Fort Mercer at Red Bank. Initially, the Rhode Island troops were able to defend Fort Mercer and repel British and Hessian troops. However, the British were able to capture Fort Mifflin, forcing the Rhode Island regiments to evacuate the forts. As a result of the battle, 14 were killed and 21 were wounded. They received praise and commendations for their exploits there, and their commander, Colonel Green, received a commendation sword from the Rhode Island Assembly. Commander Green was the commander of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. What was their ultimate reward for their service at Red Bank? Winter at Valley Forge. So, after their major battle at Red Bank in New Jersey, the Frank brothers and their regiments marched to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for the winter encampment of 1777 to 1778. Now, I know the hype is all that Valley Forge was the worst winter encampment during the for the Continentals during the Revolutionary War. There was a worse winter at Morristown, New Jersey from 1779 to 1780. But this is the one everyone points to, all right? So while they were encamped there, American troops did suffer major losses due to disease, illness, and desertion. Washington described the encampment as, quote, composed of men half-starved, always in rags, without pay, and experiencing every species of distress, unquote. The food rations were in such short supply that many of the Army regulars threatened to revolt. The slogan was, quote, no bread, no meat, and no soldier, unquote. At the end of 1777, Washington notified Congress that over 2,800 soldiers were unfit for duty because they were barefoot or otherwise naked. William Frank was one of those soldiers. A week later, an additional 1,000 men were on the sick row. Over 3,000 soldiers deserted. The Rhode Island regiments were decimated as well. Due to their losses, there were barely enough soldiers left to form one regiment. To solve this problem, the Rhode Island commanders decided to fill their dwindling ranks by recruiting and enlisting enslaved men from Rhode Island. Colonel Angel described their situation this way. Excuse me. He wrote, I am sorry to inform you that a very great sickness and mortality prevail among the Rhode Island troops, which is judged to proceed in some measure from the badness of their cloths, unquote. And the rate of desertion also concerned Angel. Quote, desertion is what we may ever expect so long as the soldiers see that public faith is not to be depended upon, unquote. General James Varnum, who had overall command of the Rhode Island regiments at Valley Forge, was also concerned about the state of the Rhode Island troops. He said, quote, the two Rhode Island battalions have been sickly. They have lost a considerable number. This is owing to their immense fatigues, meaning their work, in the summer past, unquote. So what did they do? They recommended, General Varnum and his staff recommended to George Washington and to the Rhode Island General Assembly that they could recruit and enlist a battalion of enslaved men from Rhode Island. They were able to convince General Washington and the Rhode Island Assembly to allow for that to occur. The Slave Enlistment Act was passed on February the 14th, 1778, and it basically stipulated that any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave, unquote, could now enlist with the Rhode Island regiments. As you can see, the second paragraph says, excuse me, it is further voted and resolved that every slave so enlisting shall, upon passing muster before Colonel Christopher Green, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free. Now, the recruitment and enlistment of enslaved men did not last long. Rhode Island slave owners opposed the new law. They feared the consequences of armed ex-slaves on those that were still in bondage. Their opposition did eventually prevail, and in June, the Rhode Island Assembly repealed its law. But in that 4-month period, over 100 free and formerly enslaved African Americans enlisted. Among them were Africa Burke, Cato Green of Providence, Primus Brown of Johnston, Rhode Island. And free blacks also enlisted during this period, including Peter Daly of Warwick, Rhode Island. Colonel Christopher Green of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment accompanied his captains, and they were sent from Valley Forge to their home state of Rhode Island, and they were given the task of returning there to recruit and enlist individuals to serve in a new regiment, and they were able to do so. However, this may have also been the first case of sanctioned segregation in American military power in history. Military historian Robert Wright Jr. has called it, quote, an experiment in segregation, unquote. Why? Because the new recruits, the formerly enslaved men, were combined with 70 documented veteran Black and Native American soldiers from the 1st and 2nd Rhode Islands to form the new reconfigured 1st Rhode Island Regiment. The Frank brothers and other soldiers of color were transferred from the 2nd Rhode Island to the reconfigured 1st Rhode Island. The reconfigured 1st Rhode Island Regiment became known as the Black Regiment. On the screen are copies of 2 documents that address that change. On the left side of the screen there is a sentence that is underlined, and that is part of a pension application from Private William Champlin. And he testifies, as he's trying to get his pension, he makes notice that the white men in Colonel Green's regiment were transferred to Colonel Israel Angel's regiment. The second document is titled A Return, meaning a listing of free men enlisted for the war. I believe this return listed some of the freeborn and previously free men of color who served with the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. For some reason or another, they wanted to capture the individuals who were free before the Slave Enlistment Act. That is my opinion. And I have a red arrow pointing to the 2 names of William and Ben Frank. To give you a very general overview about the first battle of this combined unit, this reconfigured unit, the Black Regiment, their first battle together would occur on their home soil in Rhode Island. Their regiments were assigned to participate in the Rhode Island expedition. The main object of the expedition was to drive British forces from Aquidneck Island and the important port city of Newport, where we're sitting right now. It was led by native Rhode Islander John Sullivan and was the first joint effort between American and French forces. The Rhode Island troops had to be excited about this, about the opportunity to kick the British completely out of Rhode Island. Not only that, but they were going to fight side by side with their new allies, the French, who had come to the aid of the Americans after the American victory at Saratoga in October 1777. Real quick, the expedition failed. Which you all know, right? The American forces were unable to overcome the defenses at Fort Adams. Additionally, French naval ships were prevented from participating in the important parts of the battle due to bad storms and damage upon the fleet. They fled to Boston for repairs and did not return to give support. Also, British reinforcements were sent to repel the American attack. So the Americans were forced to flee the island on August the 29th, and was during that retreat that the Battle of Rhode Island occurred. British forces from Fort Adams chased after the retreating troops and caught them. William and Ben Frank, along with other members of the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments, were assigned to protect the right wing of the American line near Durfee's Hill. During the afternoon hours in the heat of the day, they repelled combined British and Hessian forces on 3 separate occasions while being bombarded with volleys from British ships in the harbor. By the end of the day, American forces safely retreated from the island. If you want to learn all of the particulars about the Battle of Rhode Island, I would recommend that you read Christian McBurney's book, The Rhode Island Expedition. It is wonderful in the details. It's amazing. The total casualties for the battle was 30 killed, 137 wounded, and 44 missing. For the 1st Rhode Islanders, 3 were killed and 9 were wounded, and 11 came up missing. The Frank brothers were among the survivors. And after the battle, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was then assigned to shore duty patrol in Rhode Island. So what does a younger brother do when he is in the middle of fighting a war and he's not getting paid properly? And he's a member of something they call the Ragged, Lousy, Naked Regiment. What does he do when he's on shore patrol duty in his home state? He gets married. He got married. It was during this period of time in January 1779 that Ben Frank got married. He married a young woman by the name of Sarah Wilbur. As you can see on the screen, that is a copy of their marriage certificate. He was 18 years old. Sarah was the mother of 1 child by the name of Abraham. They were married by Elder John Gorton of the 6th Principal Baptist Church of East Greenwich, Rhode Island. Elder Gorton had also married Ben's younger sister, Hannah, to Solomon Wanton, a comrade of Ben's in the Black Regiment. Okay? A year after his marriage, however, Ben Frank made a pivotal decision. So let's review his life up to this point. He's about 18 years old. He's married with a family to support. He's serving with an army that could not afford to clothe or feed him. He and fellow soldiers were called the Naked, Lousy, Raggedy Regiment. He had survived the miserable winter at Valley Forge. He fought in 2 major battles, and on both occasions, they had to retreat. He had lost comrades at both battles. At this point, he may have been convinced that Americans could not win the war. So what did he do? He deserted. He left. In March of 1780, he deserted the Continental Army. It was not uncommon for Revolutionary War soldiers to leave their companies and regiments for home. 1/5 to 1/3 deserted during the war. As stated before, poor pay, equipment, lack of food, and even homesickness drove many soldiers to desert. For Ben, there was the additional burden of marriage and having a family to support with insufficient and unsteady military pay. The military records on the screen indicate that Ben signed up for the duration of the war. It says DW. At this point, however, Ben may have believed that he signed up for a 3-year enlistment and that his enlistment was almost completed. But for whatever the reasons, Ben Frank left, leaving his brother and his wife behind. His wife, Sarah, would return to her hometown of Middleborough, Massachusetts, taking her son with her. William Frank would continue his service with the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. So I don't know how the segregation of the Rhode Island troops affected him and others. I don't know. But I have tracked over 53 soldiers of color, freeborn or free before their enlistment. Before the Slave Enlistment Act and segregation, only 3 deserted. After the act, 17 deserted, including Ben and his brother-in-law, Solomon Wanton. He also deserted. Solomon was retaken and would later die of disease in camp, leaving his wife, Ben's sister, Hannah, a widow. Ben was never retaken. William Frank continued to serve. So why? He may have felt responsible to uphold the family name after his brother deserted. He may have felt a sense of loyalty to his fellow soldiers in the Rhode Island regiments. Maybe he didn't want to jeopardize his chances of getting money or land for his service. And maybe he believed that the Americans would win and he would reap the benefits of being a veteran member of the army that liberated America. For whatever reasons, he re-enlisted in February of 1781. He re-enlisted for the duration of the war, and he would continue to serve with the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. On the screen is a listing of Rhode Island soldiers that was compiled in 1781 by the Rhode Island Military Administration. It's called the Rhode Island Regimental Book of 1781. It has a lot of interesting information in that book. And as you can see, the 3rd individual from the top is William Frank. You can see how tall he was. He wasn't a very tall man, according to our standards now. And most of them were only around 5'5". The tallest individual that I can find as a member of the Black Regiment was an individual by the name of Frank Gold, who was 6 foot tall. He's about the tallest that I could find. But what is really interesting and really good for me as a researcher, it showed where William Frank lived, where he resided before when he was recruited, and where he was born. And that could help me to identify members of that Johnson, Rhode Island family in 1774. In early February 1781, the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments were consolidated into a single regiment. And that's because the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment had taken heavy casualties in the Battle of Springfield. And this new 1st and 2nd Consolidated Rhode Island Regiment was now commanded by an individual by the name of Colonel Christopher Green. The reorganized unit contained 2 companies of black soldiers, at least. That spring, Green and his soldiers found themselves encamped in Westchester County, New York. And they had the primary responsibility of guarding Continental lines. One of those soldiers was an individual by the name of Lieutenant Jeremiah Greenman. He was assigned to command the guard at Pines Bridge, one of the 2 bridges that spanned the Croton River and was the northern barrier of what they called neutral ground in Westchester County, New York. But this neutral ground was an area of almost daily confrontation between loyalists and patriots. And there was a lot of guerrilla warfare that was being carried out by a loyalist group that was led by Colonel James Delancey. This group was known as Delancey's Corps of Refugees. It was composed of American-born soldiers who resided in Westchester County and had chosen to remain loyal to the British cause. At sunrise on Monday, May 14th, 1781, Delancey led his loyalist militia of over 200 soldiers towards Pines Bridge. One group attacked Colonel Green's headquarters, which was located at Davenport House. A second party struck Greenman's guard at Pines Bridge. And on the screen is how Lieutenant Greenman, he was just recently promoted to that rank, how he described what happened to him that morning. He said, "This morning was alarmed by the appearance of a party of cavalry supported by infantry, which proved to be Delancey's Corps of Refugees. They soon surrounded me, and being vastly superior in force and having no prospect of escape, I thought it the most advisable to surrender myself and the guard, and surrender them as prisoners of war. They informed me that Colonel Green was mortally wounded and Major Flagg was killed." Lieutenant Greenman and Peter Daly, one of the free blacks that enlisted during the Slave Enlistment Act period, were captured, and they were held as prisoners of war until the end of the year. The most brutal fighting occurred at Davenport House, and I am standing in front of Davenport House in Westchester County, New York there. It's still standing. They've added some things to it, but for the most part, it looks the same. And that is where Colonel Green and a small detachment of his soldiers were ambushed. Major Ebenezer Flagg was shot in the head while he was reaching for his pistols. Colonel Green was wounded in the initial attack, and his wounded and dying body was strapped to a horse and dragged a mile towards British lines. Eventually, Delancey's troops left the colonel's body at the side of the road, and he would later be buried alongside of Major Flagg at the First Presbyterian Church in Yorktown Heights. On the left hand of the screen there is a really nice monument to the Black Regiment at Westchester County in Yorktown Heights. And it is to memorialize what happened there. And they try to make it really very realistic. As you can see, the individual that is next to the member of the Black Rhode Island Regiment, at his rear, that is a depiction of Colonel Green. And as you can see, they try to capture the fact that he just was woken out of his sleep. He's not wearing any shoes, and he's just fighting so hard against the people that were ambushing him. I personally believe that the reason that his body was so misused, because he was dying. They knew he was dying. He was stabbed 5 or 6 times. There was no way he was going to survive that. But the fact that they actually dragged his body in such a disrespectful manner, I think that was because he was the leader of black troops. I really do. And there's some oral histories out of Westchester County that might help to prove that fact. So Delancey's troops killed 8 black soldiers of the 1st Rhode Island at the Davenport House. Among them were Prince Childs, Africa Burke, Cato Bannister, and Simon Whipple, and along with actually killing the Major and Colonel Green. William Frank survived the attack at Pines Bridge. As a member of the consolidated 1st and 2nd Rhode Island, he served at the pivotal Battle of Yorktown in October 1782, that for all intents and purposes ended the war. William served a total of 6 years. He was around in his mid-20s upon his discharge. 12 years after his discharge in 1795, he would eventually receive back pay. Yeah. And he would eventually receive his land bounty, which he promptly sold. He settled in his hometown of Johnston after the war and became part of a growing population of free blacks of over 3,400 in the state of Rhode Island. Another 1,000 blacks remain enslaved. What you are looking at is a picture of the 1790 federal census, the first census of the United States, and he is listed, if you look at the red arrow, he is listed as the free head of household of 2. His brother Ben's life was a little bit more complicated, just a little bit. After Ben Frank left the Continental Army, he signed up to serve with British troops. He wasn't alone in fleeing to the British. Thousands of enslaved people fled to the British lines as a result of Dunmore's proclamation.
Some deported.
Yes, indeed, and some were deported too, yes. At the end of the war, many of the defeated British troops and loyalists, black loyalists among them, made their way to New York City, which is the last British stronghold in America. Those loyalists remained at New York until the final peace treaty was negotiated and passage was arranged for them to England or British colonies in the Caribbean and Canada. Part of the treaty promised the return of all confiscated property by British to its rightful American owners. This included the formerly enslaved. However, British officials refused to return many of the fugitive slaves that had run to the British seeking their freedom during the war. But the British were willing to make fair compensation to the owners of enslaved persons not returned. They never made compensation. I'm just going to say that right up front here. In order to do so, they compiled an inventory of the blacks within British lines at the end of the war. This inventory became known as the Book of Negroes. Ben Frank, a freeman and former Continental soldier, is listed in the Book of Negroes as Ben Frankham in the book, and he is listed there along with around 3,000 other black loyalists. That is a picture of the page that Ben Frank is listed on. In October of 1783, Ben Frankham was a passenger on a ship taking him and other loyalists from New York to Nova Scotia. They were part of a fleet of over 80 ships and 40,000 loyalists heading to Nova Scotia. Yeah, we're eventually getting to the Nova Scotia part here. Ben and others embarked on a ship called the Brig Elijah. They were deposited at Port Mouton, there where the red arrow is pointing, in late 1783. By April of 1784, where the yellow arrow is pointing, Ben Frankham had relocated to the settlement of Birchtown, Nova Scotia. That was several miles northwest of the largest city of Shelburne, Nova Scotia. And at this point in time, Birchtown became the largest free black settlement in North America, with a population of over 1,500. Many of those black loyalists lived in makeshift huts. As you can see, there's a picture of a reconstructed one by the Black Loyalist Heritage Society. Some black loyalists found the northern climate and frontier conditions in Nova Scotia difficult, and they were also subject to discrimination by other loyalist settlers. Also, the land that was given to black loyalists was the most rocky and hard to cultivate compared to that which was given to white loyalists. And in 1792, prompted by the request of several black loyalists, the British government offered them the chance to settle in a new colony in Sierra Leone, Africa, in Freetown. More than half of the black loyalists in Nova Scotia, nearly 1,200 of them, departed the country and moved permanently to Sierra Leone, including Henry Washington, formerly enslaved to George Washington. So George never got his slave back. Ben, now calling himself Ben Franklin, eventually married. He remarried. He married a young lady by the name of Margaret Jackson. She was the daughter of another black loyalist, and they eventually settled in Granville Ferry, Nova Scotia. Ben Franklin and his wife had 9 children who survived until adulthood. All were baptized in the Anglican Church, and he passed away sometime after 1838. Thomas Henry Franklin, the landscaper, my great-grandfather, is a direct descendant of Ben Franklin. He passed along the family history to the next generation. Before his death, he passed the story to his sons, Peter and John William Franklin. John William Franklin with the dapper hat here on the end, that's my grandfather, right? In the early 1900s, John left Nova Scotia for New York City looking for work. So let me tell you what happened. So this is what happened. One of the first jobs that you got if you were a young man in Nova Scotia was on a whaling ship. They still had whaling expeditions during that period of time. And my grandfather was on a whaling expedition and got hurt. And they dropped him off in New York City to get some medical treatment, and he stayed. That's how that happened. Following the Franklin tradition, both Peter and John served in World War I. Peter served with a battalion from Canada, and John Williams, since he's living in New York, served as part of a New York regiment. My grandfather married late in life, and he settled in Lynn, Massachusetts, and he passed away in Lynn in 1966. He never gave up his Canadian citizenship. And he always made sure that we knew that he was not from America, that he was from Nova Scotia, Canada. There was a Canadian flag in the dining room, and I would ask him, why do we have a Canadian flag in the dining room here, Pa? We called him Pa. And he said, that's because that's where I'm from. I'm from Nova Scotia. He passed along his story of the Frank family, the Frank / Franklin oral tradition, to his two sons. Check out the names. I call them the Frank brothers part 2. John William Franklin Jr. and Benjamin R. Franklin. They continue the Frank military tradition. They both served in World War II, and they both served in the Korean conflict. So let me tell you what happened there. So this is what happened with this. They get out of World War II. My Uncle Buster, John William Franklin Jr., served in the Philippines. My Uncle Ben, with the cool sunglasses on there, I don't know how they let him do that, but anyway, with the cool sunglasses on, he served in Europe. At the end of the war, which they both survived, they come back home to Lynn, Massachusetts, and the older brother, my Uncle Buster, convinces his younger brother, my Uncle Ben, and some of their friends, let's sign up for the National Guard. It's no big deal. We just have to do a couple of weekends a month and maybe do a week in the summer. We got this. We'll make some extra money. And then Korea happens, and they all got called up. And this time, they served together. And they argued for the duration of the war. They argued for the duration of the war. And to end, I would like to read a section from the book, from the epilogue. Okay. Learning about the Franklin family background and origins has been a fascinating personal journey. Their struggle to gain standing in their communities and to fight on equal footing with their white counterparts in the Continental Army has helped me to put my own life and career choices in perspective. Like the Frank brothers, I followed in my own father's footsteps when I became a police officer in Toledo, Ohio in 1976, one of the first female officers on the department. My father, a well-respected police investigator and Civil War history buff, instilled a love of history in me. And like Rufus Frank to his sons, he was an inspiring figure in my life. But did the heritage from my maternal line instill an unconventional streak in me that allowed me to envision myself as someone equal in a male-dominant workforce? It is possible that this non-conforming trait came from the Frank/Franklin line. Throughout my research, I have often asked myself which of the brothers I identify with the most. And even though Ben's life and decisions provide a better framework to understand my own predilection to take the road less traveled, as the oldest sibling of my family, I tend to identify with William, the older brother, who was persistent and steadfast in his service. But I am not judgmental or unsympathetic to Ben's actions and decisions. To the contrary, the combination of these two dichotomous personalities has found a home in this author and motivated me to not only continue their history of public service, but to also write their story. All right, that's it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Oh, Dr. Green, thank you for your hard work and great presentation. My question concerns when the former 140 or so former enslaved blacks achieved their freedom. Local historian Robert Geek, in his book Slaves to Soldiers, told me it wasn't when they signed up, as the proclamation said, they had to serve their 3 years. What is your understanding?
My understanding is once they mustered with Colonel Green that they earned their freedom. But Robert has done more research in that area about the enslaved service, so I am not going to argue with him about it, but the law stipulated that once they mustered with Colonel Green, that they gained their freedom. That they gained their freedom, yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Oh, well, I want to thank you, Dr. Green, for such an incisive and comprehensive study. And
Thank you.
So you're making history real for us.
Thank you.
I feel a kinship with you because My father's name is Frank Williams.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I have an uncle
Just
Lester,
re-
too.
oh, there you go. There you
And
go.
the whole connection, my mother served in the British Army, and
Okay.
they're from Jamaica, but the American ones, her first cousin was a Tuskegee Airman, and
Mm-hmm.
people in England and Canada, and I lived there. But this is so amazing. Did you do the DNA test? And you make me want to do it. So,
Yes.
You did this from a DNA test?
Yes. For some reason or another, my Uncle Ben agreed to have a DNA test done. And once the results came back, he was a match for a young man who was a member of the Away people in present-day Togo, and he was also a match for a young man that lived in the Dominican Republic, which shares the same island as Haiti, we all know. When I told him the results of the test, he was very happy about the African connection, but when I got to the Dominican Republic connection, there was a pause, like crickets, nothing on the phone, and I'm like, Uncle Benny, did you hear that? It really verifies the Franklin oral tradition. And he said, they don't even speak French over there, honey. I said, okay, that's all right. Yeah, he was very upset about that. But yeah, that's how the DNA was the background for that. Yes.
And they were no fools. They were smart.
Yes, very smart.
They knew where to go.
Very smart.
And I want to say the word NIGRO is a big Dominican or Spanish name as well.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. Any other questions? Yes, Christian.
The statue at the Pines Bridge.
Yes.
Looks very impressive. Would you like to see one in Rhode Island?
Yes, I would. Definitely would like to see one. That is an amazing. Now, having said that, I talked to the young man who started the drive to raise the funds and have the monument at Pines Bridge erected. And it took him several years to do so. And he was just a graduate student. He was just a graduate student when he started it. But yeah, I think Rhode Island is big enough to have another statue dedicated to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Definitely. Yes, James.
So there's a chance that East Grange will have one we're working on it.
Let's hope so. Oh, great. Well, there's your answer.
A few weeks ago about it, and we're talking about having it.
That's good.
For East Grange's birthday, hopefully. And then for the day of the 1st Rhode Island showing up there.
If you want some information or contact information for the folks in Westchester County, I can provide that for you too.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think the numbers of desertion might have been more caused by racism that was experienced?
For the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, I think something about the segregation prompted them to leave in larger numbers than they had before. But it could have also been the length of service by that point in time. It could have also been another bad winter, and they just got tired. It could have been any number of those things. I think segregation played a part in it, though, definitely. I think so. Because they were now being given different tasks and assignments than they had been before. Yeah. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I think I would like to say that the 1st Black Regiment in Portsmouth, Rhode Island was a huge success for the Newport NAACP and for Mr. Paul Gaines, who was a friend of mine, and his wife is still working very hard for children, even though she's retired. But when I take a look at that regiment, I remember 1974, the first little rock that I could put my arms around.
Oh, yeah.
That they contributed to the fact that, yes, we pushed back the British 3 times. And I often say to people, if it hadn't been for that regiment, the United States might still be under British rule.
Right, there you go. Thank you for those comments, Mrs. J. Any other, yes, sir.
And that rock is still there.
Yes, it is. I have a picture standing next to the rock. Yeah, it's still there. It's still there.
Having to stay there as a kid and run around in there with Mount Paul. And it's one of my favorite places.
It is very cool there. It is very cool there.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
Thank you
sharing
for
the
having
story.
me.
And I know our partners from Rhode Island have
I have a challenge for
Making the trip,
Oh,
and there's our
thank you.
new
Oh,
coin
this is very
for
nice.
the Black Regiment.
Wow, that's nice.
And then we have a print
Oh,
local artist of the Black Regiment during the battle.
this is so nice. Thank you very much. Everybody see this?
Yeah.
Isn't this nice? Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
We have a surprise gift.
Uh-oh. Oh, wow. Okay. This is why I do these things, right? No, I did not expect any of this, so.
Yeah, for my family, the Rose family,
Oh.
went from slaves to soldiers in the
Uh-huh.
1770s.
Oh, thank you.
Designed the shirt, and I'd like you to have it.
Thank you.
For
Can
representing-
someone get pictures here?
Yeah.
Let me step over my,
Bringing the history of my,
Make it good.
yeah, I'll get around here and I have
the
to,
history alive of the
Hold on
Black
here.
Regiment. And
oh, get that. Here we go. Okay. Please send these to me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.